Joe Biden is out, Kamala Harris is in. Meanwhile, JD Vance is Trump's new VP pick. What can this tell us about the next 4 years of U.S. China relations? We'll discuss this and much more on the China Report. Welcome to the China Report, a new show made in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee, and this is my co-host, KJ Noh. KJ, why don't you kick it off with the headlines?
Trump says Taiwan should pay more for defense and dodges questions if he would defend the island. In an interview with Bloomberg magazine, in response to the question, would you defend Taiwan against China? Donald Trump asserted that Taiwan must pay the U.S. for its defense and claimed that the U.S. was no different than an insurance company. He said, Taiwan doesn't give us anything. Taiwan is 9,500 miles away. It's 68 miles away from China. He did not clarify in the interview if the U.S. would commit to defending Taiwan province, which the U.S. officially recognizes as part of the PRC. Instead, he asserted, Taiwan took our chip business from us. They're immensely wealthy, and I don't think we're any different from an insurance policy. After the interview was published, the share prices of TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, dropped 2.5%.
CPC Central Committee charts path to achieve an advanced socialist society by 2050. The third plenary session of the 20th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China was held in Beijing last week. The session adopted a resolution listing a set of reforms. The objective of this being the deepening of the modernization process on the path to the complete building of an advanced socialist market economy by 2035 and an advanced socialist society by 2050. According to the communiqué released, the next few years will be devoted to improving the quality of modernization, development of productive forces according to local conditions, deepening supply-side structural reforms, and overall improvement of living standards and people's well-being. This year's meeting was held amidst the rising global and domestic challenges which China faces in terms of protectionism pursued by countries such as the U.S. and its allies, rising geopolitical interventions in the region, and the relative slowing down of the Chinese economy since the outbreak of COVID.
Self-exiled Chinese billionaire Guo Wengui convicted of defrauding followers after fleeing to U.S. After a 7-week trial in a Manhattan court, anti-China dissident tycoon Miles Kwok was found guilty of 9 out of 12 criminal counts, including racketeering, fraud, and money laundering. Prosecution argued that he had defrauded his followers of over $1 billion. A major critic of the Chinese government, he was closely allied with Steve Bannon, with whom he launched in 2020 a domestic U.S. campaign with the goal of overthrowing the Chinese Communist Party. Kwok used his swindled money to finance an extravagant lifestyle, which included a 50,000 square foot mansion with a $1 million chandelier, a $1 million Lamborghini, and a $37 million yacht. Kwok's lawyers argued during his defense that it's not a crime to be wealthy and that his ostentatious lifestyle was a critique of the Chinese Communist Party. Kwok left China in 2014 during a government anti-corruption campaign and ardently criticized the government from his exile. Chinese authorities accused him of corruption, bribery, rape, and other crimes. Western mainstream corporate media that dismissed Chinese allegations and promoted his criticisms of China have quietly stopped lauding and lionizing him and have started referring to him as Chinese businessman Guo, reverting to his official Mandarin Chinese name.
Palestinian factions agreed to form unity government after talks in China. China brokered the reconciliation of 14 rival Palestinian factions, including Hamas and Fatah, in a major diplomatic breakthrough by Beijing. The agreement, named the Beijing Declaration, aims to promote a comprehensive, durable, and sustainable ceasefire in the Gaza Strip as a first step in a multi-step process to Palestine being admitted to the United Nations as a fully fledged member and becoming an independent state. Foreign Minister Wang Yi on Tuesday said the signing of the agreement was an important historic moment in the Palestinian cause, and that reconciliation is an internal matter for the Palestinian factions, but at the same time, it cannot be achieved without the support of the international community. He added that China was keen to play a constructive role in safeguarding peace and stability in the Middle East. China has long been a principled supporter of Palestinian liberation, supporting the PLO directly since the 1960s and recently defending Palestinians' right of resistance against Israeli occupying aggression at the UN.
CrowdStrike shares tumble as fallout from global tech outage continues. A negligently written security update by the IT endpoint security firm CrowdStrike took down the servers of government and private corporations across the world last Friday, affecting transportation, infrastructure, security, finance, retail, healthcare, and emergency services, resulting in massive chaos around the world. James Bohr, a cybersecurity professional, told the Associated Press, "There are going to be deaths because of this. It's inevitable." CrowdStrike had been warning for years that Chinese hackers were poised to take down computer systems all over the US and gained lucrative contracts from this threat inflation. Last Friday, it did the very thing that it claimed that it was protecting against, creating the greatest computer service outage in the history of IT. CrowdStrike first became famous for its attribution of security incidents to US adversaries, attributions that it often made instantaneously without offering any concrete evidence. It attributed the 2017 Sony Pictures hack to North Korea, the 2016 DNC hack to Russia, which became the foundations of Russiagate, and attributed countless security threats, incidents to China, which it labeled as a state-directed persistent threat. It also lobbied to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars anti-China legislation.
At least 11 people killed, dozens missing in China bridge collapse. Last Friday, a highway bridge in the Chinese province of Shanxi partially collapsed, killing at least 11 people, with dozens more reportedly missing. All the victims were recovered from 5 vehicles that fell off the bridge due to a sudden downpour and flash floods, according to Chinese news agency Xinhua. Chinese President Xi Jinping has urged an all-out rescue and relief effort to safeguard people's lives and property, Chinese media reported. And now to our main story. Well, big news out of the Democratic Party this weekend. Joe Biden stands down, and Kamala Harris is the new presumptive Democratic nominee. KJ, I don't know how you feel about this. She was the DA of San Francisco for a few years. She had a really terrible record of incarcerating parents of truant children. She supported the racist war on drugs. She failed to release prisoners whose sentences had already been served, kind of arguing that, their prison labor was a really important source of revenue for the state of California. And as far as, what we can expect from her if she were to become president, based on statements that she's made on Ukraine and China, it doesn't really feel like it would be that much of a departure from what we're already seeing in the Biden administration. So I'm just curious about, what this portends in terms of Ukraine and China.
Well, I think the general consensus among the pundit class is that there will be no daylight between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden as far as foreign policy is concerned moving forward. Just to do a quick recap on the China front, remember that Barack Obama in 2012, 2011 declared the pivot to China. This had actually been prepared since 2008, 2009 after the financial crash. And that policy of containing and escalation against China has had constant continuity across all these administrations. Essentially, the Biden administration is a continuation of the Obama doctrine with a slight neo-mercantile, uh, uh, bypass by Donald Trump. But I think that if we have a new Kamala Harris administration, it will be essentially the same thing: escalation to war, continued escalation towards kinetic war, continued hybrid war, continued economic warfare. I think this is written into the cards. Regarding Kamala Harris's, track record, I think she doesn't have a foreign policy track record because she was never involved in anything significant, at least prior to this administration. But I think it's important to highlight that as a prosecutor, as the attorney general, she was criticized on multiple occasions for systemic prosecutorial misconduct. In fact, appellate court, labeled her case as uh, as a prosecutorial misconduct that shocks the conscience, which is very, very strong language. As you pointed out, she refused to let prisoners go in order to use their prison labor for free or for cheap. She prosecuted marijuana users, up to 1,500, whom she imprisoned, while clearly smoking herself and laughing about it. And then this is, kind of a personal little incident that I feel is important, is that she created the conditions, the objective conditions, whereby children would kill themselves by criminalizing truancy. What do I mean by this? Well, one of the major causes of truancy is bullying at school. So children who are bullied at school don't want to go to school. And if you criminalize that instinct for self-preservation and you threaten their parents with death, with imprisonment, you put the child in an untenable situation, which mental health professionals have said will lead to children attempting suicide. And I know this is the case in at least one person who I know personally. She was she was bullied throughout her school years. She was taken into the principal's office, and she was told that her parents would go to prison if she didn't come to school. And as a result of this, she attempted suicide. So I think this kind of uh, blindness of the effects of policy, if not a kind of lack of care and thinking through of the effects of that she could have. I think these are very, very bad symptoms, very, very bad signals for how she could be if she were to be, at the leadership of the country.
You talk about continuity in terms of foreign policy, and I think we need to talk about the genocide in Gaza. It really feels like the Democratic Party forcing Joe Biden to step down and throwing his support behind Kamala Harris seems like a last-ditch effort on the part of the party to save its chances of winning the election, right? It's clear that Gaza was the issue that really sunk the Biden campaign. Ever since October 7th, his poll numbers have been, plummeting. And it was the mass movement that kind of cohered around the issue of Gaza, the regular protests every day, almost every week, almost every day, that kind of forced the issue to be in the headlines regularly, to force people to, acknowledge that there is still a genocide in Gaza going on. And it really killed his chances of reelection. And so it feels like sort of a last-ditch effort on the part of the Democratic Party to kind of save their chances in November. And what I see right now is a lot of media pundits kind of trying to say that Kamala Harris that she is somehow more sympathetic to Gaza than Joe Biden. And they do this by saying that, she was the first person to call for a ceasefire in the Biden administration. They make the point that at one point she described Israel's genocide in Gaza as a humanitarian catastrophe. So, like, these are just words, of course, and it seems like the bar is really on the floor. And so I feel like, these are just words. And materially speaking, there doesn't really seem to be an indication that her policy toward Palestine would differ that much from the Biden administration's. What do you think, KJ?
I think you're right on that. I wish there were some daylight, just the slightest difference. I mean, that could make the difference in thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of lives. But once again, I think there is no daylight between her and Biden. As we know, the Biden administration's approach towards Palestine is essentially Likud Netanyahu's approach. That is essentially genocide and ethnic cleansing. And I think the only difference is that the Biden administration wants to have the optics whereby it can plausibly distance itself just a little bit from Netanyahu's genocidal rampage. And I think that Kamala Harris, I do not believe that she will make 1 ounce of difference. I mean, we'll see. I mean, she's going to meet with Netanyahu very shortly. I think if we were, in a rules-based society that followed international law, Netanyahu would be being arrested as he came into the United States. But I don't anticipate that happening. I think that what we will see is just a kind of a subtle, full-throated, under the table backing of Netanyahu with a few publicity, rhetorical admonishments, to make it seem like the U.S. is not 100% behind this. I think that that is the best that we can hope for, which is also why I think that it's important for the Biden administration's policy to be challenged from top to bottom.
Meanwhile, J.D. Vance was appointed Trump's VP pick last week. Vance is kind of this rising star, a very young 39-year-old millennial. I've been familiar with Vance for several years now because, I'm from Kentucky, and J.D. Vance kind of rose to prominence a few years ago. He wrote a book called Hillbilly Elegy, and, conservatives love him because he's become like this representation of this like so-called working class rural guy from rural America who supposedly picked himself up by the bootstraps and became like an Ivy League educated like politician. It's a kind of a fake hillbilly shtick, I think, because from what I understand, he's also backed by a lot of big tech people. But, he has, in the beginning, a few years ago, he was kind of this anti-Trump Republican. And over the last few years, maybe he sort of sensed where the winds were blowing. And now he's like firmly behind Trump. He's now his like VP appointee. He had a speech at the RNC the other day where he kind of laid out, his plans for China. He's a bit of a China hawk. He accuses China of building their middle class on the backs of American citizens. He accused China of flooding the U.S. market with cheap Chinese goods. So how do you see J.D. Vance in terms of what it could mean for China policy if Trump were to get reelected this November?
It's a little bit hard to tell. I'm trying to read the tea leaves. I was watching the Republican Party platform very carefully. Of course, there were the obligatory attacks on China, but at the same time, almost all of those attacks were also linked to the Biden administration. These were not direct attacks at China. It was this trope that China and the Biden administration have been colluding, which is interesting, and that is a slight difference from the previous campaign under Trump. So I'm continuing to observe that, but the main sense that I get from this is, all you have to do is look around you. You know that, the country is not doing well. I'm in the Bay Area. There are 1,400 homeless encampments in Oakland alone. There's this systemic failure that capitalism generates systemic failure. And it's clear that the Democrats refuse to acknowledge this systemic failure, and where they do, they're just putting in palliative and insincere measures designed to paper over the contradictions until the next election. Now, it's clear that the Republicans are aware of this hypocrisy, and therefore you're seeing a kind of for populist agenda mixed in with, also because they're still capitalist Republicans, this meme of personal responsibility, which you also saw in Hillbilly Elegy. And that, of course, dovetails with this kind of foundational individualist ideology, which is used under the system to divide and conquer, every man, every woman for themselves. And it also ties in, if I can wax a little theological, there's this line from St. Augustine. It says, "Do not despair. The one on the left was saved. Do not presume. The one on the right was damned." And I think J.D. Vance is going to be playing the role of the good cop. He's the person who's saying, "Do not despair. Help is on the way. We have the solution." And probably at the same time, the Trump administration, if they succeed, they will likely bring on another hardliner to enforce the bad cop message, which is do not presume, buck up, submit, or you can pass out. So I think that's the key issue. I think it's a kind of a good cop, bad cop routine that we're seeing right now.
I think you mentioned this earlier, but J.D. Vance kind of, he represents two things, two political currents within the Republican Party. The first is like this kind of faux populism meant to appeal to the working class, to middle America, but he also represents this kind of isolationist, this foreign policy isolationist approach that opposes U.S. government sending weapons to Ukraine, opposes more funding to NATO, not necessarily, of course, on any kind of anti-imperialist basis, but on the grounds that they see NATO as like a massive transfer of U.S. wealth to Europe. And Europe, in their eyes, should be spending their own money on their own defense. And they see, they see this money that's given to NATO as money that's being drained from the U.S. that should be redirected toward, further military aggression, further confrontation with China. They see the war in Ukraine as something that takes away from confronting our true enemy, which is China. And this isolationist approach isn't really something new. It can be historically traced back to like the early 20th century. It was really popular during World War II, and it kind of receded during the Cold War, and it's sort of reemerging again with the likes of Donald Trump, Josh Hawley, Marjorie Taylor Greene, those kinds of people, right? And it calls for this kind of anti-interventionist foreign policy, so-called anti-interventionist foreign policy, coupled with high tariffs, along with this really vicious anti-immigrant nativist sentiment. So, how do you see this in terms of, the ongoing war with China if Trump were to get reelected?
Again, a little early to tell, but what's clear is Donald Trump is at the end of the day, he's a bean counting mercantilist or neo mercantilist. And he's very, very transactional in his approach, in his foreign policy approach. Whether that will actually translate into meaningful non interventionism and isolationism remains to be seen. Remains to be seen. I think that Trump is not against wars per se, he's against losing wars. And so he doesn't like wars where the US is losing or looks to be losing because he always wants to project this aura of strength and success and being a winner. But I think that we just have to track it very, very carefully. Clearly, he sees NATO as a free rider. He sees Europe as a free rider. He's said that he's going to increase, he's going to make South Korea pay more to the United States. Currently, South Korea is paying about $1 billion a year for the privilege of being militarily occupied. And he says that he's going to make them pay more because he considers them to be a free rider. Now, if that is the case, South Korea could simply say, no, we're not paying more. In that case, will Donald Trump say, okay, we're going to take our troops away? That's exactly what the vast majority of South Koreans would actually like. It would de-escalate tensions, but I don't know if that's going to happen. So much remains to be seen. As we discussed in the headlines, also, he said that Taiwan must pay more as well. So he sees things through this very business-like, transactionalist, mercantile lens. Can that actually translate into less interventionism? I think that remains to be seen. I think there is still a structure, call it deep state or other, which has such an institutional momentum towards building towards war, as I said, starting 2008, 2009, that it may be hard, to turn the ship around or for any single administration or even individual to prevent that, forward momentum.
I do think we can get a sort of a picture into what a China policy would look like under Trump by sort of looking at who will likely be appointed in his administration. One likely person who will be a part of his administration is this guy named Elbridge Colby. He was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development under the Trump administration. He crafted Trump's 2018 National Defense Strategy, which identified China as the greatest threat to the U.S. And we actually have a video of him. If we could show it, I think it might give us a little bit of a window into what the next 4 years would look like under Trump.
Strategy of conservative realism would call for a balance of manifest strength in Asia, but also openness to a modus vivendi with China. We must be laser focused on the rightful conservative goal here, to preserve peace, if at all possible, but a decent peace, one that ensures Americans are safe, free and prosperous, and thus by necessity prevents China from dominating Asia. Pursuing this aim must involve two pillars. One is the manifest military strength and resolve to use it that shows Beijing that it will not succeed in using its growingly formidable military force to dominate Asia. This is not about soft power or photo ops with allied leaders. This is about refocusing and husbanding our scarce military industrial power to show Beijing that it will not gain from attacking, that the United States and our allies and partners in the region, whose fates are even more threatened by China's ambitions, can and will be able to deny its aggressive moves against us. Meeting this standard will require a sharp change in our global strategy, not only from the current administration's unfocused and gauzy approach, but also from the globe-spanning primacism that denies we must focus our scarce resources and political will. But the other pillar is also critical. We must make clear to Beijing that our strategy does not necessitate its strangulation or humiliation, that we are not seeking to regime change or occupy China. We do not need to dominate China. Rather, we must make sure it cannot dominate us. Instead, we're seeking a balance of power, one in which China is not humiliated, but in which it must respect our interests, including our core interest in reindustrializing and strengthening our economy.
I forgot to mention earlier, but Elbridge Colby is another one of these figures that represents the Republican shift toward this America First isolationism. He also is an anti-NATO guy. He also, was quoted as saying, Europe isn't pulling its weight in defense. But in terms of China's strategy, in the video, he said the strategy would be to manifest military strength and resolve to use it as a way to maintain peace with China. And it's part of this Republican peace through strength tactic that they want to take in regard to China. Trump has cited this peace through strength strategy in 2017 as part of his as a crucial component of his America First policy. And Robert O'Brien is another one of these peace through strength guys. He was the national security advisor under Trump, will likely be in the next Trump administration. In this issue of Foreign Affairs, which came out in July, he wrote an article, and it's called The Return of Peace Through Strength. And I'm looking at it right now. This article chastises Biden for not going far enough on China. It accuses the Biden administration of cooperating too much with them. It argues for higher tariffs, more aggressive export controls. He argues that the U.S. should force Taiwan to spend more money on their military and expand military conscription. And he also argues that the entire Marine Corps should be sent to the Pacific. So this is what the peace through strength strategy is. And it really makes clear that peace through strength is an oxymoron, right? It's basically calling for further escalation with China. It's calling for further escalation of the U.S. current policy of containment of China, building up militarization of the Pacific, blocking its access to key technologies to hinder its economic development. And to be honest with you, peace through strength, that's just code, and it's a total oxymoron because no country on earth, least of all China, would tolerate being barricaded inside of its own territory like this, right? What Washington is trying to do is barricade China's military inside of its own territory and cripple its economy with no other option to fight its way out. So peace through strength is just another way of further escalating. It's driving us into a war with China, basically.
And they're perfectly aware of this. I mean, even in, classical, neorealism, we call this the security dilemma. What you consider to be, quote unquote, a defensive or security strategy is actually a threat. Now, I think that Colby goes a little bit further. He's a very, very smart person. He belongs to this kind of dynastic national security elite. His grandfather was the head of the CIA, and he has mapped this out in just extraordinarily wonkish detail. But essentially, his idea is that we continue to escalate, we continue to provoke, we continue to securitize Taiwan Island. And then when China wrong foots itself, then we build a strategy of denial. We bring all of our allies together and use that as a way to punish China. And there's a kind of 20-step syllogism that he's mapped out. It's the kind of intricacy of his thinking is fascinating. But essentially, what it does is it's a way of using the pretext of security and peace as a way of provoking and creating aggression. It's a very, very dangerous strategy. I think that the Chinese have seen through it. I think that the U.S. ruling class knows exactly what they're doing. But this is essentially provocation for war. I think it also contrasts also with Matt Pottinger, and actually it coincides or overlaps with Matt Pottinger's views on.
I'm glad you brought up Matt Pottinger because Matt Pottinger is a really key figure. And I think most people probably haven't heard his name, but most people are probably familiar with his influence and his policies. Matt Pottinger was a former Wall Street Journal reporter reporter. He was in the U.S. Marines at one point, and then he became the deputy national security advisor under Trump. And he's probably largely responsible for the biggest shift in China policy in decades, right? He coined the term Wuhan virus. He really spearheaded that conspiracy theory that COVID leaked from a Wuhan lab. And he actually popularized it. In addition to that, in 2017, he helped write the Trump administration's national security document that officially named China as a strategic competitor and labeled China a revisionist power. And he also led a review that culminated in the State Department slashing the number of visas offered to Chinese journalists, claiming that they worked for state propaganda outlets. And this was the event that really led China to expel a number of journalists from U.S. Publications that were headquartered in China, including the Washington Post, I believe. Another thing that he did was he encouraged Trump to place Huawei on the Commerce Department's entity list, making it more difficult for American companies to do business with it. He also wrote a foreign affairs article in the May and June issue, which praised Biden for his China policy. He said Biden's China policy was a bright spot in the administration that was beset with failures. But also at the same time, he chastises Biden for not going far enough in his China policy. He says that Biden's China policy is one of strategic competition or managed competition, but that we don't need to manage competition with China. We need to win it. And so it's a very aggressive, but almost honest and straightforward policy that Matt Pottinger is kind of advocating for. So he writes in this article that, an appropriate policy toward China would call for further raising tariffs. It would call for the expansion of export controls into key areas of U.S. innovation like biotechnology. It would call for increasing military recruitment, more recruitment into the intelligence and national security communities. So I guess, KJ, how do you square Pottinger with these other Trump-aligned people?
So, I think the key thing to point out is we don't know who will actually be appointed yet. But certainly Colby, Pottinger, O'Brien, all of these people are still very, very influential inside the national security state. So regardless of whether they're directly engaged or whether they're still, in the background, giving advice, we can be assured that they still have a lot of influence. Now, regarding Pottinger's position, Pottinger's point is that we cannot contain China. We have to defeat it. That's his bottom line. And I think it's very clear that, his point is that we have to hurt China at all costs, even if it hurts ourselves, no matter the cost to ourselves. And we saw that during his tenure with Donald Trump. He was one of the longest serving members of the Trump administration. But during that period, he, spared no efforts to use COVID as a political weapon, regardless of the cost to the American population or to anybody in the world. So I think that shows you how deeply committed he is to undermining, attacking, and hurting China at any cost. And, just to give you a little bit of personal background, what we do know about Matt Pottinger is that he was originally a journalist in China for the Wall Street Journal. Apparently, he would, kind of use his journalistic privilege or perhaps his white privilege to barrel into situations where he was not invited and to confront his targets. He was doing that when there was an Iranian official delegation in China. He wanted to confront them around nuclear, issues, etc. And the Chinese security perimeter did not allow him to intrude. And he claims that he was punched in the face by a government goon, and that seems to have had a kind of a tremendous effect on him. In one of those, kind of plot twists, it's almost like a Hollywood B movie. Is after that he quit journalism and he joined the Marines, and he was 31 years at the time. It's not an age where you usually join the Marines, and most people, at that age can't cut it. But anyway, he decided he was going to join the Marines. He was training to join the Marines, and he passed out, and it required the best of Beijing's medical care actually to revive him. So he actually owes them a debt for saving his life. But he joined the Marines. He joined military intelligence. He was kind of nurtured under Mike Flynn, and since then he seems to have had this kind of extraordinary bee in his bonnet about hurting and attacking China in every possible way. He is one of a straight flush of China hawks from Donald Trump's administration. If you think of LMNOPR, that is Lighthizer, Mnuchin, Navarro, O'Brien, Pottinger, Pence, Pillsbury, and Pompeo, and then Ross. He's one of this kind of straight flush of China hawks that are still very, very influential, and that we have to be very cautious about. There's certainly, I believe that these people are deeply, deeply ideological. In the case of Pottinger, I think there's some real personal animus, and I think they're dead set on escalating to kinetic war against China.
Absolutely. And it's clear that whether Kamala Harris or Donald Trump wins the election in November, war with China is a bipartisan issue. Now to our closing segment. It's a new segment called Every Accusation is a Confession. KJ, you touched upon this in your headline segment, but last Friday, a security update was automatically installed across all Microsoft servers. It led to the greatest service outage in the history of IT, as you mentioned earlier, caused by what seemed like negligently written security update. And basically every device using a Windows client or a Windows server, it got stuck on a blue screen, got stuck in the restarting state, which is what people call this like the blue screen of death, I guess. Digital payment systems crashed. It forced banks, hospitals, news broadcasters to go offline. It was chaos at airports as their servers went offline, and people were grounded at airports and they didn't know what was happening. They didn't know when their flights would be rescheduled. So for people like me who don't follow tech that much, this may be the first time we've heard of CrowdStrike, but KJ, you wanted to talk a little bit more about this.
Well, CrowdStrike is an endpoint security system, and they have, this software that they call Falcon, which has deep privilege. That is, it goes directly into the deepest bowels of your computer or your server to turn it on, turn it off, and to control it, ostensibly under the guise that it is going to protect you from hacking and intrusions. It's a little bit like, you have, for example, in a company, a security company that has all of your keys. Well, what happened with this outage was that CrowdStrike had it had rolled out an update to its security system. This update was badly coded. It was incompatible with Microsoft Azure or some other Microsoft programs. And when it was rolled out, it essentially shut down the entire system. Everything running that system was shut down. And so we know that at least 15 million devices were affected. This is the greatest outage in the history of IT. And I think, the real irony here is that CrowdStrike became prominent because it was constantly threat inflating against China. Essentially, they were saying that, China is hacking all of the Fortune 500 companies. China is this existential threat to our IT security, and we have to prevent, massive, meltdown. And then the next thing you know, they have created the meltdown that they have been saying all along that they would protect against us against. So it's the greatest own goal in the history of IT. It is the greatest self hack in the history of IT, and it just it reminds me of that kind of old horror movie trope, where you're getting this threatening phone call, you try to trace where it is, and they tell you the phone call is coming from inside the house. I mean, this is exactly that type of situation. Instead of protecting us from quote unquote, bad actors, CrowdStrike created, the worst catastrophe in IT history to date. And I think it's very obvious, the national health system went down, medical systems went down, emergency systems went down. I think it's pretty obvious that there were people who died from this. And I think once again, it points out to us, the dangers of this monopoly corporate capitalist system that is deeply tied to the national security state, which is really more interested in doing propaganda and serving its own agenda rather than actually serving the security of its clients.
As they say with the U.S. and China, every accusation is a confession. Well, that's all the time that we have. Please like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week on the China Report.